After a pair of entries that saw the Battlefield series revisit the past, Battlefield 2042 is a trip back to the future. Low-tech battles in European villages are out, replaced with massive, highly vertical conflict set in the megacities of the near future. With huge maps, an overhauled class system, and an intriguing new portal mode, it's an undeniably ambitious entry. It's still a cross-gen release, of course, with versions for current and last-gen consoles and PC, but the multiplayer offerings here have tremendous scope. So how far has the Frostbite engine been pushed with this release? And how well do the massive maps run across Series X, Series S, and PlayStation 5? Battlefield games are known for their scale, and Battlefield 2042 ups the ante with impressive 128-player battles on current-gen consoles and PC, up from 64 in prior titles. Battles here are absolutely massive, with firefights often consisting of dozens of players. The sheer density of combat here can be stunning, particularly in the breakthrough game mode, where all players fight over a small number of objectives. Now, it's true that some Battle Royale games have similarly high player counts, but at a much lower typical player density. You won't get scenes like this in Call of Duty's Warzone, for instance. Players are just too spread out. It's a very impressive accomplishment. But perhaps the most interesting addition to Battlefield 2042 is its Portal mode. This mode allows you to create custom games based on maps from Battlefield 2042, as well as prior Battlefield titles. There are 6 additional maps in this mode, recreations of maps from Battlefield 1942, Bad Company 2, and Battlefield 3. These new Portal maps are paired with a myriad of options to customize your experience, including a rudimentary game logic editor. It's somewhat reminiscent of the Forge feature in the Halo games, albeit with less map customization and more customization of game modes and player abilities. It's a great addition, but the presentation here feels a little bit odd. Consigning these 6 maps to community servers with custom game types is quite limiting. It feels especially odd given that almost half of Battlefield 2042's 13 maps are exclusive to this mode. Surely these maps should be part of the main game in a more substantial way, maybe occupying their own playlist, for instance. Still, it's a welcome inclusion, particularly for players who remember these prior Battlefield titles fondly. The only real sacrifice here from a content perspective is the complete lack of a single-player campaign. Battlefield games have been trending in this direction for years now, with recent titles containing stripped-back episodic stories in lieu of the traditional single-player campaign. It's a bit of a shame, but considering the amount of multiplayer content, I think it's mostly been made up for here. Battlefield, of course, is a series known for achieving a high level of graphical fidelity, each entry in the series stretching back all the way to 2005's Battlefield 2 has been very visually impressive, often pushing contemporary graphics hardware to its limits. Battlefield 2042 follows suit, with great-looking, colorful visuals. Fans of recent Battlefield and Battlefront titles will know the score here. Massive playable areas with lots of geometry, great PBR materials, beautiful lighting, and impressive particle effects. The chaos here often looks stunning as a result. Compared to past Battlefield releases on consoles, we're seeing a few key improvements in this title. Battlefield 2042 features lush, abundant foliage that's a step up from the flora contained in prior Battlefield titles. The new vegetation really does enhance the look of many maps, particularly maps with a more natural setting. This is probably the most immediately noticeable difference between current gen and last gen. On the 1X version here, we can see that foliage has been significantly pared back. There are impressive weather effects at play here as well. Battlefield 2042 features massive, map-changing storms, with tornadoes, sand gusts, and rain swells. The GPU particle system first used in Battlefield 5 gets a great workout here, adding all sorts of dust and dirt particles that get thrown around by the wind and collide with the environment. Finally, screen space reflections are also present here, for the first time in a console Battlefield game. No, there's no ray tracing, but we do see some reasonable looking reflections in general play, an improvement from prior Battlefield titles on console, which relied exclusively on cube maps. These do tend to look a little messier than in many other titles, however, as they exhibit noticeable haloing where they intersect with scene geometry. The general impression, however, with Battlefield 2042 is that fidelity has not taken a huge leap from its recent predecessors, although there are substantial visual enhancements and a very welcome increase in scope. Some maps also look a little boxy and plain, owing to large concrete areas with little in the way of clutter, though this seems like more of a gameplay decision than a technical one. Some players will undoubtedly feel a little bit disappointed that we haven't seen a ray tracing implementation here, or 120Hz support. I do feel like this is a fair trade-off for the enhancement to map size and player count, although as we'll see soon, those features do seem to carry a framerate cost as well. Performance in Battlefield 2042 is an interesting case. There's definitely a sense that framerate and stability aren't quite what they should be, particularly in the new 128-player modes. But first, resolution metrics. Series X and PS5 are unsurprisingly on top here. Both of the premium consoles turn in a typical resolution of 3840 by 2160, a full 4K. Dynamic res does seem to be in effect here, although it's fairly subtle and only seems to kick in during intense scenes. I counted a low of 1800p on PS5 and 2016p on Xbox Series X, although it's possible there could be dips below those numbers in rare circumstances. PS5 and Series X look very sharp and stable, and look great on a 4K display. The final image displayed across both consoles is precise and clinical in appearance and free of significant aliasing. Series S exhibits the expected drop in resolution, with a typical pixel count of 1296p. I counted a low of 1080p, but generally the Series S maintains its target resolution. Series S expectedly presents a blurrier, muddier image with some significant shimmer. On a 4K display, the image doesn't hold up terribly well, although it would be well suited to a 1080p panel. Other aspects of image quality across the consoles are more or less as you'd expect, although the screen space reflection and ambient occlusion implementations can look a little bit temporally messy. The ambient occlusion in particular looks a bit odd, with pronounced breakup in motion. Framerate is an interesting story here. Let's start with the good news first. The modes with 64 players and below seem to run great across all current-gen platforms. This includes the Hazard Zone and Portal game modes. On Series X, S, and PS5, the readout is 60 FPS on each console, with only occasional one-frame dips. These modes feel great to play, though the scope is much smaller than the 128-player mayhem of the main game. The 128-player modes, however, well, there's some room for improvement. On each console, we see somewhat frequent framerate dips. The framerate tends to dip in intense battles, in areas with a high player count, or when flying aircraft. Across the current-gen consoles, these problems aren't too bad. We generally see a pretty solid 60 with occasional dips. It's very playable, and generally these problems are not a major impediment to the gameplay experience. At worst, we see readouts in the low to mid 50s during more intense gameplay. 60 FPS is still in the cards most of the time, but the dips are noticeable and sometimes distracting. Perhaps worse though is the frame time spikes. 50 millisecond stutters occur sometimes, although these can last for hundreds of milliseconds at worst. These spikes are unpredictable and seem to come and go depending on the game session. Thankfully, there is sort of a solution to the performance problems, if you can accept some compromises. You can download the Xbox One and PS4 versions on the Series and PS5 consoles, and enjoy a fairly flawless 60 FPS experience in the large player count modes, although you only get a maximum of 64 players on these versions. Unlike most Xbox Series titles, Smart Delivery doesn't seem to be enabled, so you can download and play the base Xbox One version of the game even if you've purchased the Series version. The graphical downgrade isn't too bad, but you do miss out on the enhanced foliage and high-res textures of current gen, as well as screen space reflections, high-res shadows, and a handful of other improvements. And the maps, while smaller, do still feel a little bit too empty with just 64 players. Unfortunately, it's not currently possible to select 64-player versions of these maps on the native Xbox Series and PS5 versions of the game, which would likely fix the performance issues experienced in the 128-player modes. The only way to play the larger maps with 64 players instead of 128 is to download the Xbox One or PS4 versions of these games and play them running under backwards compatibility. It's a bit of a shame that we couldn't simply get reduced player count versions of the existing maps implemented on current gen. It's not an easy choice. You trade some graphical and gameplay features for a locked frame rate. As an aside, it would be nice to see this implemented for non-performance reasons as well. Smaller versions of the maps with lower player counts and different match types were present and enjoyable in prior Battlefield games, and it feels odd that they haven't been included here. The performance issues just make the demand all that much more urgent. I did notice one other performance issue on all consoles, however, and it's a problem that Battlefield players are all too familiar with. This is an issue called rubber banding. It's a sort of movement-related network sync stutter that's been present to some degree in Battlefield titles, stretching all the way back to at least Battlefield 3. It presents as a persistent stutter on player movement during some matches. It's quite annoying and actually feels similar to a frame time spike, although the frame rate doesn't actually drop. Your character just momentarily pauses. This seems to come and go on an unpredictable basis in my testing on a gigabit wired connection, although your experience may differ depending on your internet connection quality and your distance from the server. There are noticeable bugs in the current build as well. Thankfully, these are mostly fairly minor issues and visual quirks in my experience. For instance, your loadout options sometimes disappear on the spawn screen, and I got occasionally match made into lobbies where it was impossible to spawn in. There are also some occasional quirks with physics, though this won't come as a surprise to longtime Battlefield players. Hopefully, these performance issues can be ironed out soon. Until then, I'd consider Battlefield 2042 a bit of a qualified success. The visuals here are attractive, if decidedly cross-gen, and the increase in player count feels like a real accomplishment. Performance is another story, but in frame rate terms, the current gen consoles aren't too far off the mark. Network stability, bugs, and frame time spikes all need some attention, however. But with that, we've reached the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for notifications for new videos. To view a high-quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch, just use Twitter. That's all for me for now. Thanks for watching.